The slap echoed across the compound, sharp and final. Zainab staggered, her cheek burning as the words followed harder than the hand. "You are leaving today." Villagers paused mid-step, drawn by the tension hanging thick in the air. Her small bundle lay at her feet, already packed, her fate decided without her voice. Across the yard stood the man she had been forced to marry, leaning on a stick, his damaged leg dragging in the dust as whispers spread like fire. Shame wrapped around Zainab's chest, tightening with every stare. Hunger clawed at her stomach, fear at her throat. She searched her mother's face for doubt, for pity, but found only relief. In that moment, Zainab understood she was not being given away in marriage. She was being erased from her own home. Before we go deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. And if stories of injustice, courage, and unexpected hope move you, don't forget to subscribe. Zainab had learned the language of hunger long before she understood words like love or fairness. In her father's compound, hunger was not always the absence of food, it was the rule that decided who deserved to eat and who should wait. From the time she could carry a clay pot on her head, she knew her place. She was the one sent to fetch water before dawn, the one who swept the yard while others slept, the one whose name was called only when something needed to be done. Her father, Baba Kweku, was a man of few words and heavy silence. When he spoke to Zainab, it was usually an order. Go, bring, hurry. He never asked how she was. He never noticed the cracks on her heels or the way her shoulders ached from carrying loads meant for two people. To him, she was simply there, useful, quiet, replaceable. Her mother, Mame Efia, was different but not kinder. She measured her children by what they brought into the house. Zainab brought labor, sweat, obedience. Her younger sisters, Adwoa and Sika, brought laughter, beauty that could be shown off, and promises of good marriages. When visitors came, the sisters were dressed in clean wrappers and beads that clicked softly when they walked. Zainab stayed behind the hut, scrubbing pots or feeding goats, her clothes faded and thin from years of use. At mealtimes, the hierarchy was clear. Baba Kweku ate first, then Mame Efia, then Adwoa and Sika. Zainab waited. Sometimes she stood by the doorway, pretending not to be hungry, pretending her stomach wasn't twisting itself into knots. Only when everyone else was full would her mother push the pot toward her and say, "Finish what's left." Some nights there was nothing left at all. Zainab learned to smile anyway. Crying only brought trouble. Yet despite everything, people noticed her. Zainab had a quiet beauty that could not be hidden by rags. Her skin carried a soft glow, her eyes deep and thoughtful. Her movements gentle even when she was exhausted. Boys from neighboring villages came, sending elders to speak on their behalf. They brought small gifts, yams, palm oil, sometimes a goat, and asked about marriage. Each time, Mame Efia's eyes lit up with ambition. If you want her, she would say loudly, you must prove you are serious. The demands grew heavier each time. 10 goats became 15, 15 became 20. Cash was added, cloth, more livestock. The suitors hesitated, then slowly disappeared. Baba Kweku never objected. To him, a daughter was an investment, and Zainab was the most valuable one, at least in theory. As the years passed, the questions began to change. Neighbors whispered, "Why is that girl still here? Is something wrong with her?" Zainab heard it all while carrying water or walking to the market barefoot behind her mother. She lowered her head and kept walking. She had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. Inside her, however, something was growing, quiet, fragile, but stubborn. Zainab believed, without knowing why, that life could be more than this. She dreamed small dreams, a home where she would not be afraid, a place where her presence did not feel like a debt. She never spoke these dreams aloud. Dreams spoken too loudly had a way of being crushed. The day everything changed began like any other. Zainab had just returned from the stream, sweat running down her back when she saw her mother approaching from the market. Mame Efia's steps were quick, her face bright in a way Zainab had not seen before. There was excitement there, sharp, almost hungry. "Zainab," her mother called, "leave that pot, come here." Zainab obeyed, wiping her hands on her wrapper. She stood quietly, eyes lowered. "Pack your things," Mommy Afia said. "You are getting married." The words hit her like a blow. Married. Her heart jumped, then froze. No suitor had come. No family meeting had been held. She dared to look up. "Married," she repeated softly. "Yes," her mother replied, already turning away as if the matter were settled. "A man has agreed to take you without much trouble." "Who?" Zainab asked, her voice barely holding together. Mame Efia stopped and looked at her, irritation flashing across her face. "A farmer. His name is Kwesi. He lives at the far end of the village." Something about her tone made Zainab's chest tighten. Why him? He is poor," her mother said bluntly, "and crippled." But at least he did not argue about bride price. The world seemed to tilt. Crippled. The word echoed in Zainab's head, loud and merciless. "Mama," she whispered, "please." Mame Efia raised her hand, silencing her. "Enough. You should be grateful. A girl your age still eating in her father's house is a shame. We cannot carry you forever." Baba Kweku said nothing. He sat on his stool, eyes fixed ahead as though Zainab were not standing there at all. That silence hurt more than any insult. That night Zainab lay awake on the hard floor of the hut she shared with her sisters. Adwoa and Sika slept easily, whispering about beads and dances. Zainab stared into the darkness, tears soaking the mat beneath her cheek. She did not cry loudly. She had learned better. She cried the way people cry when no one is coming to save them. She thought of the man she was being sent to. She had seen him before from a distance, a figure limping through the fields, bent over his work children, pointing and laughing behind him. She remembered how alone he had looked. At the time, she had turned away quickly, afraid that looking too long might invite the same fate. Now that fate had a name. By morning, her small bundle was ready. A single wrapper, an old cloth, a wooden bowl. That was all she owned. As she stepped into the yard, the sun was already high, unforgiving. Neighbors had gathered, curiosity pulling them closer. Whispers floated in the air. Zainab did not look back when she was told to walk, because deep down she knew there was nothing behind her worth returning to. Kwesi lived where the village seemed to forget itself. Beyond the last row of compounds, past the narrow footpath that cut through wild grass and stubborn cassava stems, his hut stood alone. It was not hidden, yet people behaved as though it did not exist. Children ran past it on their way to the stream, laughing loudly only after they were a safe distance away. Adults spoke of him in half-voices, using him as a warning, a joke, or a reminder of how easily life could break a man. They called him the crippled farmer. Kwesi was not old. He was barely past 30, but his body carried the weight of years most men never lived. His right leg dragged when he walked, stiff and uncooperative, forcing him to lean heavily on a wooden stick he had carved himself. Each step produced a faint scraping sound against the earth, a sound that announced his presence before his voice ever could. Some villagers mimicked it when they thought he could not hear. Others laughed openly as if his pain were entertainment. Yet every morning before the sun fully claimed the sky, Kwesi was already awake. He washed his face at a small basin outside his hut, the water cold against his skin. Then he limped toward his farm, moving carefully but steadily, refusing to rush his body beyond what it would allow. His farm was modest rows of yams, maize, and vegetables grown from stubborn patience rather than luck. He worked with one strong leg and both hands, digging, planting, and weeding until sweat soaked his shirt and his breath came out heavy. His hands were thick with calluses, his back often burned with pain. Still, he never begged. Kwesi had learned early that asking for pity only sharpened cruelty. People gave more freely to those who appeared hopeful. He did not have that luxury. So he gave himself something else instead: discipline. Every task was done carefully. Every tool was cleaned and stored properly. His hut, though poor, was always neat. The mat was rolled straight. The fire pit swept clean. The small wooden table he had built stood firmly on even legs, unlike the man who made it. In the evenings, when the sky darkened and the village noise faded, Kwesi cooked quietly. Sometimes it was yam, sometimes thin porridge. He ate slowly, not because he had much, but because eating quickly reminded him of harder days. Afterward, he would sit beside the dying fire and reach for a small brown notebook. The notebook was old, its pages worn thin at the edges. He opened it with care, as though it held something fragile. Inside were letters written neatly, patiently, each one beginning the same way. His mother, had been dead for many years. She had been the only one who never looked at his leg before looking at his face. When sickness took her, something in Kwesi had broken quietly and never fully healed. Writing to her became his way of breathing when the world felt too tight. "Today they laughed again," he wrote one night. "A group of boys followed me from the farm, copying the way I walk. I did not turn around. I am used to it now." Another night the words were shorter. "I worked hard today. The yams are growing well. I wish you could see them. He never sent the letters. He never intended to." They were not meant to be read. They were meant to remind him that once someone had seen him as whole. Despite everything, Kwesi did not hate the village. Hate required energy, and he needed all of his just to survive. Instead, he waited. For what even he was not sure. Sometimes as he sat by the fire, he imagined a life where someone would sit beside him without fear or shame. A life where his limp would not be the first thing they noticed. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low and the market noise drifted faintly on the wind, a woman appeared on the path to his hut. Auntie Safia was known everywhere, loud, curious, and always carrying news. She stopped in front of Kwesi, hands on her hips, eyes sharp with interest. "Kwesi," she said, drawing out his name. "You are a quiet man." He nodded politely. "I try to be." She smiled in a way that made him cautious. "A family came to me today." He said nothing, waiting. "They want to give you their daughter." The words hung in the air. Kwesi felt something stir in his chest, small and dangerous. "Why?" he asked carefully. Safia laughed. Life is funny. They say she is beautiful but proud. Lazy, too. They are tired of her." Kwesi's grip tightened on his walking stick. Proud. Lazy. The words did not sit right with him. He had seen the girl she was talking about once or twice passing the stream with a heavy pot balanced on her head, her face tight with effort, eyes distant with pain. That was not the face of a lazy person. "What is her name?" he asked. Amina Safia replied. The name settled in his mind like a seed. He remembered the way she had paused once, adjusting the cloth on her head, sweat glistening on her brow. She had not seen him watching from the edge of the path. There had been no mockery in her eyes, only exhaustion. "I will marry her," Kwesi said quietly. Safia's eyebrows lifted. "You did not even ask for time to think." "I have thought enough," he replied. The news traveled fast. Some laughed, others shook their heads in disbelief. That girl, people whispered. What did she do to deserve him? No one asked what Kwesi deserved. On the day of the wedding, there were no drums, no dancing, no celebration. Just a tired-looking girl dressed in borrowed beads and a man leaning on a stick standing side by side under the harsh sun. Kwesi felt every stare, every whisper pressing against his skin. "Beauty and the Beast," someone muttered. Kwesi did not react. He watched Amina instead. She did not lift her eyes. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. She looked like someone who had already lost everything. As they walked away together after the ceremony, Kwesi carried the small cooking pot and a rolled sleeping mat. Amina followed a few steps behind, silent tears sliding down her cheeks, hitting the dust without a sound. When they reached his hut, she stopped staring at it as though it were a final sentence. "It's simple," Kwesi said gently, "but it's clean." He placed the mat inside and stepped back. "You can sleep here. I'll stay outside." Amina finally looked at him, her eyes sharp with pain. "I don't need pity," she said. Kwesi met her gaze steady and calm. "Neither do I." That night, under different roofs but the same sky, two broken lives lay awake, unaware that the waiting they had both endured was about to end. The morning after the ceremony arrived without ceremony of its own. No songs announced a new beginning. No laughter floated through the air. The village woke as it always did, indifferent to the quiet shift that had taken place. For Zainab, however, everything felt unfamiliar, as though she had stepped into a life that did not belong to her. She woke early, sitting upright on the mat Kwesi had given her, staring at her hands. They looked the same, thin fingers, small scars from years of work, but they no longer felt like hers. The hut was quiet, too quiet, and the silence pressed against her chest until breathing felt like effort. She had not slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face relieved, final, and heard the words that had ended her childhood. Outside, the village stirred. A rooster crowed. Somewhere a baby cried. Life continued unchanged, as if nothing important had happened at all. Zainab stepped outside cautiously. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of ash and damp earth. She saw Kwesi by the fire pit, his back slightly bent as he stirred a small pot balanced carefully on 3 stones. His limp was more pronounced in the soft morning light, each movement deliberate. He did not notice her at first. "Good morning," he said when he finally turned, his voice calm and respectful. Zainab nodded but said nothing. "I made porridge," Kwesi continued. "It's still hot. You should eat." "I'm not hungry," she replied, turning away quickly. Kwesi studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." There was no anger in his voice, no disappointment, just acceptance. It unsettled her more than shouting ever could have. In her father's house, refusal was always met with punishment. Here it passed quietly, like a cloud drifting by. As the sun climbed higher, Kwesi prepared to leave for the farm. He gathered his tools, slowly checking each one as if the routine anchored him. Zainab watched from the doorway, unsure of what she was expected to do. Back home, she would already have been sent on errands, scolded for standing idle. Here, no one gave orders. "I'll be back before evening," Kwesi said. "If you need anything, the water pot is full." She nodded again, still unable to find her voice. The hours stretched painfully. Zainab swept the hut, cleaned the fire pit, rearranged the few items Kwesi owned, anything to keep her hands busy. Her thoughts, however, refused to settle. She replayed the ceremony again and again, the whispers, the laughter, the weight of the villagers' eyes on her back. She wondered what they were saying now. She wondered if her sisters were already wearing her old clothes. By midday, the sun was unforgiving. Heat pressed down on the hut, and Zainab stepped outside for air. That was when the sky changed without warning. Dark clouds gathered thick and fast, swallowing the blue. The first drop hit the ground like a warning. The rain came suddenly, heavy and loud. Zainab rushed back inside just as water began to drip through a weak corner of the roof. Panic flared. She grabbed a bowl and placed it beneath the leak, her movements hurried. As she shifted to catch another drip, her foot slipped on the damp floor. She fell hard. Pain shot through her elbow as it struck the packed earth. The shock stole her breath, and for a moment she could only kneel there, stunned. Then she heard it, Kwesi's voice, sharp with alarm. "Zainab." He was there in seconds, forgetting caution, forgetting the careful way he usually moved. His stick clattered to the ground as he knelt beside her, his hands trembling as they hovered over her arm. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "Can you stand?" She pulled her arm back instinctively, anger flashing through the pain. Why do you care? She snapped, her voice breaking despite her effort. I'm just the girl your pity brought here. Kwesi froze. Slowly he shook his head. No, he said quietly. You're the girl I chose, with my eyes open. Zainab stared at him, stunned by the steadiness in his voice. You don't even know me, she whispered. I don't need to, he replied. I know what it feels like to be laughed at, to be treated like you don't matter. The words struck something deep inside her. She turned her face away, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. She hated herself for how quickly they came, for how much she wanted to believe him. Kwesi helped her to her feet carefully, his movements gentle. Sit, he said, guiding her to the mat. I'll fix the roof after the rain eases. That afternoon they spoke little. Zainab kept her distance, her elbow aching, her heart heavier than before. Yet something had shifted. The image she had carried of Kwesi as a burden, a punishment, no longer held its shape. He was still poor, still limping, still mocked by the village. But he had not looked at her with ownership or pity. He had looked at her with concern. That evening, as the rain softened to a steady drizzle, Kwesi cooked again. This time, Zainab accepted the bowl when he offered it. Their fingers brushed briefly and both pulled back as if startled. Thank you, she murmured. He smiled faintly as though the words mattered more than the meal. They ate in silence, but it was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind. Outside, the rain washed the dust from the earth, leaving the air cool and clean. Inside the hut, two strangers sat side by side, uncertain, wounded, but no longer completely alone. When night fell, Kwesi prepared to sleep outside again. Zainab watched him roll up the mat, her chest tightening. You don't have to, she said suddenly. He paused, looking at her with surprise. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. She hesitated, then shook her head. We can sleep on different sides. Kwesi nodded, respectful. As you wish. They lay down, backs turned, separated by a careful distance. Zainab stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. For the first time since she had been forced to leave her father's house, she did not feel completely disposable. She did not feel safe. She did not feel happy. But she felt something else. Something small, fragile, and unfamiliar. She felt seen. Morning returned quietly, as if nothing unusual had happened. The rain had washed the earth clean, but inside Zainab everything still felt heavy and unsettled. She woke before Kwesi, her elbows stiff and sore, her mind crowded with thoughts she did not know how to arrange. For a moment she lay still, listening to his slow breathing on the other side of the mat, unsure how to behave in a space that now belonged to both of them. In her father's house, mornings were predictable. There were commands, expectations, punishments for slowness. Here there was only silence. Zainab rose carefully and stepped outside. The sun was already warming the ground, birds calling from the trees. She washed her face, then stood there staring at the path that led back toward the village. No one would come looking for her. The realization settled quietly, without drama, and somehow that made it hurt more. When Kwesi emerged leaning on his stick, he greeted her with the same calm respect as the day before. Good morning. Good morning, she replied softly, surprised by the sound of her own voice. He prepared a simple meal and placed a bowl in front of her. She ate this time, slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her body. Kwesi said nothing, did not watch her closely, did not comment on how little she ate. He simply ate his portion and cleaned the pot afterward, as if this sharing of space were the most natural thing in the world. The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. Kwesi went to the farm early and returned before nightfall. Zainab cleaned, fetched water, and cooked when she could. They spoke in small sentences about the weather, about food, about nothing at all. Neither of them dared to ask questions that might open wounds too deep to close again. Yet even in the quiet, Zainab noticed things. Kwesi never raised his voice. When something went wrong, a pot cracking, a meal burning, he simply adjusted and moved on. He did not complain about his leg even when pain tightened his jaw and sweat beaded on his brow. At night, she sometimes heard him shifting, trying to find a position that did not hurt, but he never asked for help. It confused her. She had been taught that power spoke loudly, that authority demanded obedience. Kwesi had none of that, yet there was a steadiness about him that unsettled her in ways she did not understand. One afternoon, as the sun leaned westward, Zainab decided to walk to the edge of the farm to bring Kwesi water. She found him bent over the soil, his movements slow but determined. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his face. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," she replied. "But you've been working since morning." He accepted the water with a nod of thanks. Their eyes met briefly, and Zainab felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest. She quickly looked away, unsettled by her own reaction. As the days passed, whispers began to reach her ears. Women at the stream spoke loudly when she passed, their voices sharp with judgment. So that's her. Such beauty wasted. Life is cruel. Zainab kept her head down and said nothing. She had learned long ago that words could bruise even when no hand was raised. At night, she carried the weight of those whispers back into the hut with her, laying it quietly beside her mat. One evening, Kwesi returned later than usual. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his limp more pronounced. Zainab noticed a faint cut on his hand. "What happened?" she asked before she could stop herself. He hesitated, then shrugged. "The ground was hard today." She fetched water and cleaned the cut without being asked. Kwesi watched her silently, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said when she finished. Zainab nodded, unsure why her chest felt tight. That night, sleep came slowly. Zainab lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Kwesi's breathing. The village noises felt distant here, muted. For the first time in her life, no one was watching her closely, waiting for her to fail. The absence of that pressure felt almost frightening. Then the coughing started. At first it was light. Zainab tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass. But the sound grew harsher, deeper, tearing through her chest. She sat up, pressing a hand to her mouth, her body trembling. Kwesi was awake instantly. "Zainab." His voice was alert, concerned. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the words betrayed her. Another cough bent her forward, pain slicing through her side. Kwesi reached for her arm, steadying her. His touch was careful, uncertain. "You're burning up," he said, alarm creeping into his voice. By morning, the fever had taken hold. Zainab's head throbbed, her body weak and uncooperative. Kwesi tried to cook, tried to coax her into eating, but she could barely lift her head. Panic flickered in his eyes, though he worked hard to hide it. "We'll get medicine," he said, more to himself than to her. "You'll be fine." But as the day wore on, reality pressed in. They had little money left. The coins Kwesi counted in his hand felt shamefully light. Zainab watched him from the mat, guilt gnawing at her heart. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "If I wasn't here," Kwesi shook his head sharply. "Don't say that." She turned her face away, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. "You shouldn't have to suffer because of me." Kwesi knelt beside her, his stick forgotten. "I made my choice," he said firmly, "and I don't regret it." Yet when he stood, Zainab saw the weight settle onto his shoulders. He stepped outside and sat for a long time, staring at the path leading toward the village. The sun dipped, lower shadows stretching across the ground. Zainab closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. When she woke again, it was to the sound of Kwesi moving around the hut, searching, counting, muttering softly. The fire burned low. There was little food left. She understood then how close they were to the edge. That night, Kwesi made a decision he had avoided for days. He would go to her parents. The thought tasted bitter in his mouth, but there was no one else. pride had no place here, not when Zainab's breathing came in shallow bursts, not when her fever burned through her thin frame. He prepared quietly, gathering his strength, steadying himself on his stick. Zainab stirred as he knelt beside her. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "To find help," he replied softly. Her eyes widened with fear. "Don't." He smiled, gentle and sad. "I'll be back before nightfall." As he stepped out into the fading light, Kwesi felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over him. He knew what awaited him at Baba Kweku's house. He knew the insults, the laughter, the cruelty. Still he walked, because love, he had learned, was not proven in comfort, but in what one was willing to endure when there was no other choice. Behind him, Zainab lay alone on the mat, her heart heavy with dread, unaware of how much that walk would cost him. The fever loosened its grip just enough for Zainab to sit up the following morning, though weakness still clung to her bones like damp cloth. Kwesi had not slept. She could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the way he moved, careful, restrained, as if one wrong step might shatter what little balance remained. He counted the coins again slowly, as though hoping they would multiply if given enough time. "I need salt," Zainab said quietly. "And a little maize. We can't go another day without food." Kwesi looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You should rest." "I will," she replied, "after the market." He hesitated, then reached into the small calabash where their money was kept and poured the coins into her palm. They felt light. Too light. Still he closed her fingers over them with care. "I trust you," he said simply. The words settled deep in her chest. Trust was something she had never been given without a price attached. She nodded, tying her scarf neatly, choosing the least worn wrapper she owned. When she stepped onto the path leading toward the village center, the sun was already high, pressing down without mercy. Eyes followed her immediately. She felt them before she heard the whispers, the slow turn of heads, the pause in conversations, the familiar tightening in her chest. Since the wedding, she had not walked through the market alone. Now every step felt like a test she had not prepared for. "There she goes," a woman murmured near the yam stall. "The one who fell from grace." Zainab kept walking. "She used to walk like a queen," another voice added. "Now look at her." She focused on the ground ahead, on the rhythm of her steps, on breathing. At the grain stall, she greeted the seller politely and asked for the smallest measure she could afford. The woman weighed the maize with exaggerated slowness, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "So it's true," the woman said, "you married that man." Zainab met her gaze briefly. "Yes," the woman clicked her tongue. "Life is strange." Zainab took her purchase and turned away, her hands trembling only slightly. She thought she might make it through without breaking. She was wrong. "Zainab." The voice cut through the market noise, loud and deliberate. She stopped. Slowly she turned. Hawa stood near the cloth seller's arms, folded her face bright with a smile that carried no warmth. They had grown up together, fetched water from the same stream, whispered secrets under the same trees. Hawa had married well. Everyone knew that. "Is it true?" Hawa asked, her voice rising so others could hear. "You really married that poor man, the cripple?" The word landed like a slap. Zainab felt the familiar heat rush to her face, but she forced herself to stand still. "Yes," she said calmly. "I did." Hawa laughed, a sound too sharp to be kind. "You, the village flower life, truly humbles us." A small crowd gathered, drawn by the tension. Zainab said nothing more. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. It was only when she reached the narrow path leading out of the market that her strength gave way. She dropped the basket. It hit the ground with a dull thud, maize spilling into the dust. Zainab sank to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Tears blurred her vision as she gathered the grains with shaking hands, trying to save what little they had. Each kernel felt like a failure she could not afford. She cried silently the way she always had. When she returned to the hut, Kwesi was sitting outside repairing a loose plank with careful focus. He looked up at once, taking in her red eyes, her stiff movements. For a moment, Zainab expected questions, accusations, concern that would demand answers she did not have. Kwesi said nothing. He simply stood and took the basket from her hands. "You should sit," he said gently. That night, after they ate in silence, Zainab noticed something outside the hut. Leaning against the wall was a small wooden stool, newly carved, its surface smooth, its legs balanced perfectly despite the uneven ground. She ran her fingers over it, recognition blooming slowly in her chest. Kwesi watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. "I made it this afternoon," he said. "I thought you might like to sit outside sometimes." Zainab swallowed hard. She nodded, unable to speak. In that simple gift, she heard the words he had not said. "I see you. I know you are hurting." Trouble returned quietly, the way it always did. A few mornings later, Kwesi left early for the farm, and Zainab stayed behind to clean. She was sweeping when she heard footsteps approaching, heavy, familiar. Her heart sank before she even turned around. "Zainab." Her mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. Zainab stepped outside slowly. Mama Efia stood in the yard, arms folded, her mouth set in a hard line. Behind her were Adwoa and Sika, dressed in new wrappers, holding baskets filled with bread and perfume. They looked at Zainab as though she were something misplaced. "So this is how you live now," Mama Efia said, her gaze sweeping over the hut with open disgust. "Shameful." Zainab lowered her eyes. "You forced me to marry him." Mama Efia laughed. "So now it's our fault. Look at you, torn clothes. No pride." One of her sisters stepped forward. "You used to look down on us," she said cruelly. "Now even rats would pity you." Zainab's chest tightened, but she did not cry. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. "To collect what is owed," her mother replied. "Your husband promised to help fix the family well." Zainab looked up sharply. "He promised nothing." Mama Efia scoffed. "Then he is useless in every way." At that moment, Kwesi returned from the farm, sweat darkening his shirt, his hoe resting against his shoulder. He stopped when he saw them, surprise flickering across his face. "Good afternoon," he said respectfully. Mama Efia's eyes hardened. "Keep your greetings. I hope your poverty is not contagious." Kwesi said nothing. He stood quietly as they left, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. That night he sat outside long after Zainab had gone to bed, staring into the bush. Zainab watched him from the doorway, guilt pressing against her chest. For the first time, she felt anger not at herself, but at the world that had taught her family to value only what could be taken. The next morning, she noticed the fence behind the hut had collapsed. Kwesi was already there, struggling to lift it back into place, his injured leg dragging in the dirt. His hand was bruised, skin broken. "Let me help," Zainab said, kneeling beside him. He tried to wave her off. "It's all right." "No," she insisted. "It's my home, too." They worked together, binding the sticks with rope. A boy passed by and laughed. "Zainab fixing fence now, wonders." Kwesi lowered his head. Zainab stood. "And you?" she called after the boy. "What are you doing for your family besides running your mouth?" The boy froze, stunned, then walked away without another word. When Zainab sat back down, Kwesi looked at her with something new in his eyes, gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head. "You're not weak," she replied softly. "They just don't see you." Kwesi looked away, his jaw tightening. Inside him, something stirred, something tied to a life he had buried, to power and truth he had sworn not to reveal. Zainab did not notice. She only knew that for the first time she was no longer standing alone. The air around the hut felt heavier after Zainab spoke those words. "They just don't see you." Kwesi said nothing more that morning. He finished tying the fence, wiped his hands on his trousers, and picked up his stick. When he walked toward the farm, his steps were slower than usual, as though each one carried a memory he had not intended to revisit. Zainab watched him go, her heart unsettled. She had meant every word she said, yet she did not fully understand why saying them felt like crossing an invisible line. For the rest of the day, she kept busy cleaning, cooking, fetching water, but her thoughts kept returning to her family. Their visit had reopened wounds she thought had already scarred over. By afternoon, the sun burned fiercely. Zainab sat on the small wooden stool Kwesi had carved, resting beneath the shade of the hut. That was when she heard voices again, too familiar, too loud to belong to strangers. Her stomach tightened. Mame Efia appeared at the entrance of the compound, her posture proud, her face set with purpose. Behind her walked Baba Kweku, silent and stern, followed by Adwoa and Sika, their wrappers bright, their heads held high. They did not greet Zainab. They looked around as though inspecting something of low value. "So this is where you ended up," Mame Efia said at last, "living like a beggar." Zainab rose slowly. "Why are you here?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Her mother laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "Don't act like you don't know. People are talking. They say your husband has been promising things." Zainab frowned. "Promising what? Money?" Mame Efia snapped. "Help. He said he would fix the family well." "That's not true," Zainab replied immediately. "He said nothing like that." Baba Kweku finally spoke, his voice low and disapproving. "Then what good is he? A man who cannot provide, cannot walk properly, and cannot help his wife's family." The words landed heavily, each one a reminder of the years Zainab had spent trying to earn approval that never came. She felt anger rise, but she swallowed it down. Kwesi returned just then, the sound of his stick tapping against the ground announcing him before he came into view. He paused when he saw them, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon," he said respectfully. Mame Efia turned toward him with thinly veiled contempt. "You," she said, "so you are the one who married my daughter and dragged her into this shame." Kwesi lowered his head slightly. "I married her because I wanted to," he replied calmly. "And what have you given her?" Adwoa asked, stepping forward. "Look at her. Look at this place." Kwesi did not answer. Mame Efia folded her arms. "We want what you promised." "I promised nothing," Kwesi said, his voice still even. The silence that followed was sharp. Mame Efia's lips curled into a sneer. "Then you are even more useless than I thought." Zainab's hands clenched at her sides. "Leave," she said quietly. Her mother's eyes widened in shock. "How dare you speak to me like that?" I said. "Leave," Zainab repeated louder this time. "You have no right to come here and insult my husband." Baba Kweku shook his head slowly. "You were always stubborn," he said. "Now see where it has taken you." They turned to go, their laughter drifting behind them like poison in the air. Kwesi remained standing long after they disappeared down the path, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on the ground. That evening he did not eat much. He sat outside, staring into the bush, his thoughts distant. Zainab watched him from the doorway, her heart aching. She had spent her whole life being blamed for existing, and now the weight of her family's cruelty seemed to have shifted onto him. Night fell quietly. The next morning, Zainab noticed the fence behind the hut had been damaged again. Several sticks loosened or snapped. Kwesi was already there, struggling to lift them back into place. Sweat ran down his face, his jaw clenched against the effort. His injured leg dragged more than usual. "Stop," Zainab said, rushing over. "You're hurting yourself. I can manage," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. She knelt beside him. "You don't have to do everything alone." Together they worked in silence, tying the fence with rope, reinforcing the weak spots. A group of boys passed by, one of them laughing loudly. "Look at her!" the boy shouted. "Fixing fence with a crippled man." Wonders never end. Quasi stiffened his hands, pausing. Zainab stood up sharply. "And what are you doing?" she called out. "Besides mocking people who work harder than you ever will." The boy faltered, startled by her tone. The others snickered, and he walked away without another word. Quasi looked up at her, surprise clear in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied. "They will never stop if we stay silent." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a quiet agreement, a shared strength. Later that day, Zainab noticed Quasi sitting by the fire with his small brown notebook open. He wrote slowly, his brow furrowed. When she approached, he closed it gently. "Is that for your mother?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "She used to tell me that silence is not the same as weakness." Zainab sat beside him, the wooden stool between them. "My mother always said silence was obedience." Quasi looked at her with a sad smile. Then she was wrong. As night deepened, Zainab lay awake thinking about her family's visit. She realized something then painfully clearly. They had never come because they cared. They came because they expected something. And now that she had nothing to give, their cruelty had grown sharper. She turned toward Quasi, listening to his breathing. For the first time, she understood that marriage had not rescued her from her family, it had revealed them. Outside, the village slept, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside that small hut. Two people, both discarded in different ways, were beginning to build something fragile but real. Something that did not depend on approval, wealth, or fear. Neither of them knew yet how many trials still waited ahead. But that night, for the first time, Zainab did not feel like a burden. She felt like a choice. The days that followed settled into a rhythm shaped by effort and restraint. The fence, once repaired, stood quietly behind the hut, its uneven lines a testament to hands that refused to give up. Zainab noticed how Quasi moved more slowly afterward, how his injured leg dragged a little heavier through the dust. He never complained. He never asked for rest. He simply adjusted his pace and kept going. Zainab watched him more closely now. Not with fear, not with obligation, but with a growing awareness she did not yet have a name for. She saw how he planned his movements before lifting anything heavy, how he paused when pain tightened his jaw, waiting it out with controlled breaths. She saw the dignity in those pauses, the refusal to be rushed into collapse. One morning, as Quasi prepared to leave for the farm, Zainab surprised herself by speaking up. "I'll come later," she said, "after I finish here." Quasi looked at her, uncertain. "You don't have to." "I know," she replied. "I want to." He nodded, accepting her choice without question. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, sweeping, washing, preparing a small meal to take along. When she set out toward the farm later that day, the sun was already high. The path cut through dry grass and low shrubs, the air buzzing with insects. Zainab walked steadily, carrying water and food, her thoughts quiet for once. Quasi was surprised to see her approach. He straightened slowly, leaning on his stick. "You came." "Yes," she said, placing the items beside him. "You'll need strength." They worked side by side for a while, not speaking much. Zainab pulled weeds and gathered stones, careful not to strain herself. Quasi focused on the heavier tasks, measuring his effort carefully. From time to time, their hands brushed as they reached for the same tool, and each time they both pulled back, unsure what to do with the awareness that followed. As the afternoon wore on, a group of men passed by the edge of the field. They slowed, eyes lingering, mouths curling into familiar shapes of judgment. "So this is how it is now," one of them called out. "The beautiful one farming with a cripple." Another laughed. "Poverty is contagious, eh?" Zainab felt the words land sharp and immediate. She stiffened, waiting for the familiar surge of shame. It did not come the way it used to. Instead, she felt something else, anger clean and focused. She stood up straight. "Keep walking," she said, her voice steady. "This land feeds us. Your mouths do nothing." The men stared, surprised by her tone. After a moment, they shrugged and moved on, laughter fading into the distance. Kwesi looked at her, stunned. "You shouldn't." "I know what I should do," she interrupted gently. "I won't let them turn silence into permission." He nodded slowly, respect flickering across his face. That evening, as they walked back toward the hut, Kwesi moved with visible fatigue. Zainab slowed her steps to match his pace without being asked. When they reached the yard, she took the hoe from his hands and leaned it against the wall. "Sit," she said. "I'll cook." Kwesi hesitated, then obeyed. As the fire crackled and the pot warmed, Zainab felt a strange calm settle over her. Cooking here felt different from cooking in her father's house. There was no one waiting to judge the portion or criticize the taste. When she served the meal, Kwesi thanked her sincerely, as though it were a gift rather than a duty. Later, as darkness crept in, Zainab noticed Kwesi sitting alone by the fire, his brown notebook open on his lap. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older, more burdened. She approached quietly. "May I sit?" He looked up, surprised, then nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the night settling around them. Zainab watched his pen move slowly across the page. "You write often," she said softly. "It helps me remember who I am," he replied. "Even when people refuse to see you, especially then." She considered his words carefully. "My whole life," she said after a pause, "I thought being quiet would protect me. But it only taught people how to ignore me." Kwesi closed the notebook gently. "Silence has its place," he said. "But so does standing your ground." Zainab looked into the fire, seeing her past flicker there, her mother's folded arms, her father's silence, the laughter of villagers. "I don't want to disappear anymore." Kwesi studied her face, something shifting in his eyes. "You don't have to," he said. "Not here." The following days tested that resolve. The market whispers grew louder. Zainab heard them even when she wasn't present, carried home on the wind, repeated by children who did not yet understand the cruelty of their words. Each time she felt the sting, but she no longer let it decide her worth. One afternoon, as she returned from the stream, a group of women blocked her path. Their wrappers were bright, their smiles sharp. So one of them said, "You've learned to farm now." Zainab met her gaze. "I've always known how to work," the woman laughed. "For a man who can barely walk." Zainab's chest tightened, but she did not look away. "He walks enough to feed us. Can you say the same?" The women exchanged glances, surprised. After a moment, they stepped aside, muttering under their breath. When Zainab reached the hut, her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding her ground. She sat on the wooden stool Kwesi had carved and let herself breathe. That night, Kwesi noticed the change in her. "You're different," he said quietly. She nodded. "I think I'm finally tired of being afraid." He smiled, small and sincere. As weeks passed, the farm began to show signs of reward. The yams grew thicker, the maize taller. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark hope. Zainab felt it each morning when she woke, an unfamiliar lightness, fragile but real. Yet beneath that hope, something stirred in Kwesi. Each time Zainab defended him, each time she spoke of dignity and choice, memories rose unbidden. Another life, another name, a world of power and wealth he had walked away from deliberately. He had buried it for a reason. He had sworn not to let it touch this life he was building. But secrets he knew had weight, and weight carried too long could bend even the strongest will. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sky darken, Zainab spoke without turning to him. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Kwesi felt the words settle deep in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, the strength in her posture, the quiet resolve in her eyes. She was no longer the girl who had followed him with tears in her silence. She was becoming someone else, someone who chose. "I know," he said softly. Inside him, the line between past and present grew thinner. He did not speak of it yet. He wasn't ready. But for the first time, he wondered if the truth would one day be unavoidable. That night, as they lay on opposite sides of the mat, Zainab stared at the ceiling, her thoughts steady. She did not know what the future held. She did not know how deep Kwesi's shadows went. But she knew this: she was no longer waiting to be seen. She was standing. The sickness returned without warning, as if it had only been waiting for Zainab to lower her guard. It began with a dull ache behind her eyes, a heaviness that made the world feel distant and slow. By evening, her body burned with fever, and the strength she had worked so hard to rebuild drained from her limbs like water from a cracked pot. Kwesi noticed immediately. "You're hot," he said, placing the back of his hand against her forehead. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed him. "You should lie down." Zainab tried to protest, tried to push herself upright, but the room tilted and her vision blurred. She sank back onto the mat, breathing shallowly. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by the pounding in her head. Kwesi moved quickly, lighting the fire, searching through their small supply of herbs, counting their remaining coins again and again, as if the numbers might change. They didn't. What little they had saved from selling vegetables barely covered food. Medicine was out of reach. "I'll be fine," Zainab whispered, though even she didn't believe it. "It's just weakness." Kwesi sat beside her, his jaw clenched. "You've been strong for too long," he said softly. The night stretched endlessly. Zainab drifted in and out of restless sleep, her dreams tangled with memories of hunger, laughter, and her mother's cold eyes. Each time she stirred, Kwesi was there, cooling her skin with a damp cloth, whispering reassurances. He wasn't sure he believed himself. By morning, her fever had worsened. Kwesi stood outside the hut, staring at the path that led toward the village. The sun was barely up, but his mind was already heavy with decisions he had hoped never to make. Pride had sustained him for years. It had taught him how to endure mockery, how to live with less. But pride could not cool a fever or buy medicine. Inside, Zainab watched him through half-closed eyes. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he leaned harder on his stick than usual. Fear gripped her chest, not for herself, but for him. "Kwesi," she called weakly. "Come here." He knelt beside her at once. "I'm here." "Don't do anything foolish," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this is too much, if I am too much." He shook his head sharply. "You are not a burden," he said, his voice firm. "Never say that again." Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. "You shouldn't have to suffer because of me." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I chose this life," he said, "and I choose you." Yet when he stood again, the weight returned. He knew what had to be done. There was only one place left to turn, one door he had hoped to keep closed forever. Her parents. The thought made his stomach twist. He had seen their contempt, heard their cruelty. Still, they had resources, and Zainab's breathing was growing more shallow by the hour. Kwesi prepared quietly. He washed his face, straightened his clothes, and steadied himself on his stick. Each movement felt heavier than the last. Before leaving, he knelt beside Zainab once more. "I'll be back," he said. Before nightfall, her fingers tightened weakly around his. "Please," she murmured. "Be careful." He nodded, then turned away before she could see the fear in his eyes. The journey to Baba Kweku's house felt longer than it ever had. Each step sent a sharp reminder through Kwesi's injured leg, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him focused. It reminded him why he was walking. As he approached the compound, he heard laughter voices raised in comfort, untroubled by sickness or hunger. He stopped at the edge of the yard, drawing in a slow breath. When he knocked, the door opened quickly. Mame Effia stood there, her expression twisting into open disdain when she saw him. "You," she said. "What do you want?" Kwesi bowed his head slightly. "Good afternoon," he began. "I came because Zainab is very sick." Her mother's eyes hardened. "And she has a fever," he continued, forcing the words past the tightness in his chest. "We don't have enough money for medicine. I came to ask for help." Mame Effia laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Help," she repeated. "You think I am a charity?" Kwesi swallowed. "She is your daughter." "Then you should have thought about that before marrying her," she snapped. "You dragged her into poverty, and now you come begging." Before he could respond, Baba Kweku appeared behind her, his face dark. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "You have nothing to offer. Leave." Kwesi fell to his knees. The movement sent pain shooting through his leg, but he welcomed it. "Please," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I am begging you. She is burning with fever. I will pay you back. I will work. Anything." Mame Effia's eyes flicked to him, cold and unyielding. She reached for a bucket of water sitting by the door. "Get up," she said. "You embarrass yourself." Kwesi did not move. Without hesitation, she lifted the bucket and flung its contents at him. Cold water soaked his clothes, ran down his face, splashed against the earth. "Leave," she said, "and never come back." The door slammed shut. Kwesi remained where he was for a moment, drenched and shaking his stick, lying uselessly beside him. Laughter drifted from inside the house, muffled but unmistakable. Slowly he rose to his feet. He did not cry. He did not curse. He simply turned and began the long walk back, each step heavier than the last. Humiliation burned deeper than any physical pain, but he pushed forward. Zainab was waiting. When he returned to the hut, dusk had fallen. Zainab stirred at the sound of his footsteps. "Did you get help?" she asked, hope trembling in her voice. Kwesi knelt beside her, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. "No," he said softly. "They refused." Her face crumpled. "What did they say?" "They laughed," he replied. "They told me to leave." Tears spilled freely, now soaking into the mat beneath her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this." Kwesi squeezed her hand gently. "None of this is your fault." That night, as Zainab slept fitfully, Kwesi sat awake, staring into the darkness. Desperation pressed in from all sides. He had no pride left to lose, no doors left to knock on. Then he remembered the rumor he had overheard days earlier, someone in the village needing help clearing land before the rains returned. The work was brutal, the pay was small, but it was something. At dawn, Kwesi made his choice. He left Zainab sleeping and walked toward the village once more. His body aching, his spirit bruised but unbroken. At the edge of the field, the landowner eyed him skeptically. "You sure you can do this?" the man asked, glancing at his stick. Kwesi met his gaze steadily. "Show me where to start." The work was grueling. Each swing of the tool sent shockwaves through his body. Sweat blurred his vision. Pain screamed in his leg, his back, his hands. But he did not stop. He thought of Zainab's fevered face, her weak grip on his hand. By sunset, the field was cleared. The man paid him a small sum, enough for medicine, enough for food for a few days. Kwesi barely felt the coins in his palm. Relief flooded him, sharp and overwhelming. He hurried home. Zainab woke to the sound of him entering, her eyes widening when she saw the small bundle in his hands. "You did this. For me," she whispered. Kwesi nodded, sinking beside her. "I told you," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I will do whatever it takes." As she swallowed the medicine later that night, Zainab felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The medicine worked slowly like dawn, creeping into a long night. By morning, Zainab's fever had eased just enough for her to sit up. Her body was still weak, her limbs heavy, but the sharp edge of danger had dulled. Kwesi watched her closely, relief flickering in his eyes each time her breathing evened out. He cooked thin porridge and fed her patiently, one careful spoon at a time, as if afraid that rushing might undo everything he had fought for. Yet the relief did not last. The coins he had earned were already fewer than he wanted to admit. Medicine had taken most of it. Food would take the rest. When Kwesi counted what remained that night, the numbers stared back at him with quiet cruelty. There would be no room for mistakes. No room for another sickness. Zainab noticed the tension in his shoulders. "You should rest," she said softly. He smiled faintly. Soon, the next morning, Kwesi left early, saying he would check the farm. Zainab watched him go, unease settling in her chest. She sensed that something had shifted inside him, a weight she could not see but felt all the same. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then dipped slightly. Zainab waited, her thoughts circling. When Kwesi finally returned, his clothes were damp, his expression closed. He said little, moved slowly, and avoided her eyes. She did not press him. Some truth she had learned arrived only when ready. That evening, hunger returned with a sharpness that made Zainab dizzy. Kwesi divided the last of the food, carefully pushing more toward her bowl. "No," she protested. "Eat." "I did," he lied gently. She did not argue. She ate because she knew refusing would only wound him further. As night deepened, Kwesi sat outside the hut, staring into the dark. The memory of Mame Efia's laughter replayed in his mind, louder, now sharper. He thought of Baba Kweku's cold eyes, the bucket of water, the door slamming shut. He had endured it once. He had sworn never to return, but Zainab's breathing still sounded fragile. The path to the village felt like a wound that refused to close. At dawn, Kwesi made a decision that tightened his chest. He would go back. This time he would not beg as a stranger. He would stand as a husband who had done everything he could. If they still refused, then at least he would know there was truly nothing left to ask for. The walk felt heavier than before. Each step reminded him of his weakness, of how easily dignity could be stripped away. When he reached the compound, voices drifted out, laughter again, the comfort of those who had never learned what it meant to choose between pride and survival. He knocked. The door opened to reveal Mame Efia, her face stiffening at the sight of him. "You again," she said. "Did I not tell you to stay away?" Kwesi bowed his head slightly. "I came to speak to Baba Kweku," she scoffed. "About what? Your misery about my wife," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. She stepped aside just enough for him to see Baba Kweku sitting inside. The man did not rise. He did not greet him. "What do you want?" Baba Kweku asked. Kwesi swallowed. "Zainab is recovering, but she needs proper food. We are struggling." "I came to ask." Mame Efia cut him off with a laugh. "Ask what? Money, food, sympathy." Kwesi straightened, leaning on his stick. "I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for help. She is your daughter." Baba Kweku's expression did not change. "She is your wife now. Take responsibility." "I am," Kwesi said quietly. "That is why I am here." Mame Efia's patience snapped. "You think coming here twice will change anything? You should be ashamed." Kwesi felt the old anger rise, sharp and dangerous. He forced it down. If shame could heal her, he said, "I would carry it gladly." For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Then Mame Efia reached for the bucket again. Kwesi saw it before it happened. He knew what was coming. He could have stepped back. He did not. Cold water crashed over him, soaking his clothes, running down his face and pooling at his feet. The shock stole his breath, but he remained standing. "Leave Mame Efia," said her voice final, "and never step into this house again." The door slammed shut. Kwesi stood there, drenched, his stick slipping slightly in the mud. His chest burned not from cold, but from the certainty that something precious had been broken beyond repair. He did not look back as he turned away. He walked until the sounds of the compound faded behind him. By the time he reached the hut, the sun was already lowering. Zainab heard his footsteps and struggled to sit up. "You're back," she said, relief flickering in her eyes. Then she saw him. What happened? Kwesi knelt beside her, water still dripping from his sleeves. He did not try to hide the truth. "They turned me away," he said softly. "Again?" Zainab's breath caught. "Did they?" "Yes," he replied. "They did." She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted them to hurt you because of me." Kwesi took her hand gently. "They didn't hurt me because of you," he said. "They hurt me because that's who they are." That night, Kwesi did not sleep. He sat outside, staring at the sky, the stars distant and cold. He felt the weight of his secret press harder than ever before. There had been a time when doors opened for him without question, a time when money erased insults before they were spoken. He had chosen to leave that world behind. But now the cost of that choice was written on Zainab's thin frame, on her quiet apologies, on the way she tried to shrink herself to ease his burden. At first light, Kwesi rose and walked toward the village once more, not to beg but to work. The landowner, who needed help clearing his field, looked him over skeptically. "You again?" he said. "You sure you're not finished?" Kwesi met his gaze. "I'm not finished. The work was worse than before. The soil was hard, tangled with roots. Each strike of the tool sent pain racing up his leg. His hands blistered, his back screamed. Sweat blurred his vision, and more than once he had to stop, leaning heavily on his stick, breathing through the pain. But he did not stop. By the time the sun dipped low, the field lay clear. The landowner nodded, impressed despite himself, and pressed coins into Kwesi's hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Kwesi returned home as darkness fell, exhaustion weighing down every step. Zainab heard him enter and forced herself upright. "You're back late," she said. He held out the coins, his hand trembling. "I worked." Her eyes widened. "Kwesi, you shouldn't have," he replied, "and I will again if I have to." She reached for him, tears spilling freely now. "You've already done too much." He shook his head gently. "There is no too much when it comes to you." That night, as they shared a modest meal, Zainab felt a quiet shift inside her. The world had been cruel. Her family had failed her. But in this small hut with a man the village called broken, she was witnessing a strength she had never known. And somewhere deep within Kwesi, the truth waited heavy, dangerous, and growing harder to contain. The days after that blurred into a test of endurance neither of them had prepared for. Zainab's strength returned in fragile pieces, small enough to be lost if handled carelessly, strong enough to give hope. She could sit up longer now. She could eat without forcing herself. Sometimes she even smiled, though the smile never lasted long before worry crept back into her eyes. Kwesi noticed everything. He noticed how she paused before standing, how she leaned against the wall when she thought he wasn't looking. He noticed the way she tried to hide her hunger so he wouldn't push more food toward her bowl. And he noticed the numbers in his calabash shrinking faster than his strength. Every morning before the sun fully rose, Kwesi left the hut. He did not announce where he was going. He did not complain. He simply picked up his stick, tightened his jaw, and walked toward whatever work he could find. Some days it was clearing land. Other days it was carrying loads at the edge of the market, ignoring the stares and whispers. Once a trader laughed openly and asked if he would fall halfway through. Kwesi said nothing. He lifted the load anyway. Pain became a constant companion. His injured leg throbbed relentlessly, the joint swelling by midday. His hands cracked and bled, the skin splitting beneath layers of dirt. At night, when he returned to the hut, exhaustion clung to him so tightly that even sitting down felt like an effort. Zainab watched him with growing alarm. "You're destroying yourself," she said one evening, her voice shaking. "Please, rest." Kwesi smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting with effort. "I'm fine. You're lying," she whispered. He sat beside her and took her hand, pressing it gently between his palms. "I can rest when you are strong again." The words settled heavy and tender in her chest. She wanted to argue, she wanted to insist. But she saw the truth in his eyes. Stopping would feel like surrender. And surrender for Kwesi had never been an option. One afternoon, Zainab woke from a light sleep to find the hut empty. Panic flared briefly before she heard the familiar tap of Kwesi's stick approaching. He entered slowly, his movements stiff, his face pale beneath the dust. She sat up at once. "Kwesi." "I'm here," he said quickly, lowering himself onto the stool. Her eyes fell to his hands. Fresh blisters had burst, leaving raw skin exposed. "What happened?" He shrugged. The work was heavy. "You didn't stop," she said, not asking. "No." Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to me." He reached out and wiped her cheek gently. "I know." That night, Zainab could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to Kwesi's uneven breathing, the faint sounds of discomfort he tried so hard to hide. Guilt pressed against her chest, heavy and unrelenting. All her life she had been taught that love was something you earned by suffering quietly. Now she was watching someone suffer loudly in silence for her. By morning she made a decision. When Kwesi prepared to leave, she sat up and called his name. "I'm coming with you." He turned, startled. "No. I can help," she insisted. "I'm stronger now." He shook his head. "You're still recovering. And you're breaking," she replied softly. They stared at each other, the tension thick between them. Finally, Kwesi exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "But you stop when I tell you to." They walked together to the farm, moving at a careful pace. Zainab worked alongside him, pulling weeds, carrying lighter loads, resting when her body demanded it. The sun beat down on them, unforgiving, but the shared effort felt different. Less lonely. Villagers passed by, surprised to see them together. Some whispered, some laughed. Zainab ignored them. Her focus remained on the steady rhythm of work, on the ground beneath her hands, on the quiet determination in Kwesi's eyes. When the sun dipped low, they returned home, tired but upright. That evening, Zainab noticed something she hadn't seen before. Pride, faint but unmistakable, in Kwesi's posture. Not the pride of defiance, but the pride of partnership. As days turned into weeks, the work began to show results. Zainab's health improved steadily. Color returned to her cheeks. Her steps grew surer. She laughed once unexpectedly at something Kwesi said, and the sound startled them both. "I haven't heard you laugh like that before," he said, smiling. I forgot how she admitted. One afternoon, as they rested beneath a tree at the edge of the field, Zainab studied Kwesi closely. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. "Why keep pushing when it hurts so much?" Kwesi looked out over the land, his expression distant. "Because there was a time when I had everything," he said, slowly choosing his words with care. "And none of it taught me how to endure." Zainab frowned. "Everything?" He glanced at her, then looked away again. "Another life," he said. "Another story." She sensed the boundary in his tone and did not press further. But the words lingered, planting questions she did not yet know how to ask. That evening, Kwesi returned from the village with a small bundle, fresh vegetables, a bit of grain. Zainab's eyes widened. "How I worked longer today," he said simply. She took the bundle, her hands trembling. "You can't keep doing this." He met her gaze steadily. "I can, and I will." Zainab felt something shift inside her, then an understanding that went beyond gratitude. This was not pity, this was not obligation. This was choice made again and again, even when the cost was high. Later that night, as they sat outside beneath the stars, Zainab spoke softly. All my life I was taught that love meant endurance without voice, that if you complained you were ungrateful. Kwesi nodded. And now, she said, turning toward him, I see that love also means standing up, working through pain together, not letting one person carry everything. Kwesi studied her face, the firelight dancing in her eyes. You're right, he said. The truth weighed heavily on him, then heavier than ever before. He thought of the doors that would open if he spoke it aloud, the suffering that could end, the lies that would be exposed, and the trust that might shatter under the weight of deception. He said nothing. Instead, he reached for Zainab's hand and held it quietly. She squeezed back, unaware of the storm gathering behind his calm. That night, as Zainab drifted into peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks, Kwesi remained awake, staring into the darkness. He knew he could not keep going like this forever. He knew the secret he carried was no longer his alone. But he was afraid that the truth once spoken would undo everything they had built with blood, sweat, and fragile hope. Afraid that the woman who now stood beside him by choice would see him differently when she learned who he truly was. Outside, the night remained still. Inside, Kwesi waited, caught between the life he had chosen and the truth that was slowly demanding to be heard. Zainab woke that morning with a strange mix of strength and unease. Her body felt lighter than it had in weeks, the fever finally gone, her appetite returning in small but steady waves. She stretched carefully, testing her limbs, then sat up on the mat. Outside, the village was already alive, voices rising, footsteps passing, the familiar rhythm of a world that never waited for anyone to heal. Kwesi was already awake, tightening the rope on his tools. When he saw her sitting upright, he smiled. It was not a wide smile, not careless, but it carried relief. You're better today, he said. Yes, she replied. Strong enough to help. He hesitated, then nodded. We'll go together later. After a simple meal, they walked to the farm side by side. Zainab worked carefully, mindful of her limits, while Kwesi handled the heavier tasks. The sun climbed steadily, and by midday the baskets were full, yams pulled from the earth, dusty but firm, proof that their labor had not been wasted. I'll take these home first, Zainab said, lifting one of the baskets. Then I'll come back. Kwesi frowned slightly. It's heavy. I've carried heavier, she replied with a faint smile. He studied her face, then nodded. Be careful. The path back to the village was narrow, winding between tall grass and scattered trees. Zainab balanced the basket against her hip, adjusting her grip as she walked. Sweat trickled down her back, but she welcomed the familiar ache in her muscles. It reminded her that she was alive, that her body still belonged to her. As she neared the edge of the village, she sensed the shift before she saw it. Laughter drifted toward her, sharp, deliberate. A group of women stood near the roadside, their wrappers bright, their voices loud. Zainab recognized them immediately. They were the same women who had whispered behind her back at the market, who had watched her marriage with thinly veiled satisfaction. Ah, look, one of them said, her voice rising. The farmer's wife. Another laughed, carrying yams like a servant. Zainab kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead. She had learned that stopping often invited more cruelty. She should have married better, a third woman added. At least a man with 2 good legs. The words cut deeper than she expected. Her grip tightened on the basket, knuckles whitening. She told herself to keep moving, to endure. But then one of the women stepped directly into her path. Why are you in such a hurry? The woman asked, smiling coldly. Afraid we might say hello to your crippled husband. Something snapped. Before Zainab could step back, the woman shoved her hard. The sudden force knocked her off balance. The basket slipped from her hands, crashing to the ground. Yams scattered across the dusty path, rolling away in every direction. Laughter exploded around her. "Look at her," someone jeered. "Can't even carry food properly." Zainab dropped to her knees, instinctively, panic surging as she scrambled to gather the yams. Dust clung to her clothes, her skin, her hair. Her hands shook not from weakness but from humiliation. Next time, the woman said, kicking one of the yams farther away, "Tell your useless husband to carry them himself." The words landed like a blow to the chest. Zainab's vision blurred. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, forcing herself not to cry. Crying here would only feed them. She gathered what she could, ignoring the laughter, the stares, the burning in her eyes. When she finally stood, the basket was only half full. She hugged it to her chest and walked away without looking back, her shoulders trembling with each step. Behind her, the laughter followed for a while, then faded, leaving only silence and the sound of her own breathing. By the time she reached the hut, her strength was gone. She pushed the door open and let the basket fall to the floor. Her legs gave way and she sank against the wall, her chest heaving. Tears came, then hot, bitter, unstoppable. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed the pain she had swallowed for weeks, finally breaking free. She cried for the humiliation. She cried for the cruelty that seemed to find her no matter where she stood. And she cried for Kwesi because she knew that if he ever heard what they had said, it would wound him more deeply than any insult thrown at her. After a long time, the sobs slowed. Zainab wiped her face with trembling hands and forced herself to stand. She washed the dust from her skin, changed into a clean dress, and stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. "You are not weak," she whispered to herself. "Do not let them break you." She took a deep breath, lifted the basket, and walked back toward the farm. Kwesi saw her coming from a distance. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing with concern. "You took longer than I expected," he said gently. "What happened?" Zainab felt the familiar urge to tell the truth, to release the weight pressing on her chest. But she stopped herself. She saw his tired posture, the strain etched into his face, the way he leaned more heavily on his stick after hours of work. She could not add to that burden. "I spilled water on myself at home," she said quickly, forcing a small smile. "I had to change." Kwesi studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her eyes, her stiff movements. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Yes," she replied, a little too quickly. "Just tired." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you for coming back." They worked in silence until the sun began to set. Kwesi reached for her hand, briefly squeezing it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for always standing by me." Zainab swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. That evening they sat outside the hut, sharing a modest meal. Zainab ate slowly, her thoughts heavy. Kwesi noticed her quietness. "You've been distant," he said softly. "Is something wrong?" She looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had endured mockery, hunger, pain, and humiliation without complaint. The man who had worked himself to the edge of collapse to keep her alive. "I'm fine," she said at last. "Just thinking." He nodded, accepting her answer, though. Doubt flickered briefly in his eyes. As night fell, Zainab lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The women's voices replayed in her mind, each word cutting anew. But beneath the pain, something else grew resolve. She would not leave, she would not run, and she would not let the world decide her worth. Outside, the village settled into sleep, unaware of the quiet strength hardening inside her. And somewhere beside her, Kwesi slept fitfully still, unaware of the battle she had fought alone that day. One she chose to hide, not out of fear, but out of love. The silence that followed the incident on the road did not fade with sleep. It settled deeper, heavier, clinging to the spaces between Zainab and Kwesi like an unspoken truth. Days passed, then weeks, And although life appeared to return to its fragile routine, something had shifted beneath the surface. Zainab carried the memory of that humiliation quietly. She did not speak of it. She rose each morning, worked beside Kwesi, cooked, cleaned, and smiled when she could. But there were moments, small, fleeting ones, when her eyes grew distant, when her hands paused mid-task, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. Kwesi noticed. He noticed how she flinched slightly when laughter drifted from the village, how she avoided the main paths, now choosing longer routes through the bush. He noticed how she watched him sometimes as if weighing something in her heart, and then looked away. At night, when the hut grew quiet and the world outside softened into darkness, Kwesi lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The truth pressed against his chest like a living thing. He had carried it for years, convinced that silence was protection. But now, each sacrifice Zainab made, each insult she absorbed in his name, sharpened the weight of that secret into something unbearable. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, Kwesi did not go outside to sit by the fire as he usually did. Instead, he remained inside the hut, seated on the stool, his small brown notebook resting closed on his lap. Zainab noticed at once. "You're quiet," she said gently, setting aside the bowl she was washing. "Are you in pain?" Kwesi lifted his eyes to hers. For a long moment, he said nothing. His face looked older, somehow carved by decisions he could no longer avoid. "Amina," he began, then stopped. He inhaled slowly and corrected himself. "Zainab, there is something I need to tell you." Her heart skipped. She dried her hands on her wrapper and sat opposite him. "What is it?" Kwesi's fingers tightened around the edges of the notebook. "I should have told you earlier," he said quietly. "I wanted to, many times, but I was afraid. Afraid." The word sent a ripple of unease through her. "Afraid of what?" "Of losing you," he replied honestly. Zainab frowned. "You won't lose me because of the truth." He closed his eyes briefly as though bracing himself. "I hope you're right." When he opened them again, there was a rawness there she had never seen before. "I am not who you think I am," Kwesi said. The words hung in the air, sharp and fragile. Zainab blinked. "What do you mean I am not a poor farmer?" He continued, his voice trembling now. "And I am not disabled." For a moment, Zainab thought she had misheard him. The hut felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. What she whispered. Kwesi leaned forward and slowly, deliberately placed his walking stick on the ground. Then with careful control, he stood straightened, putting weight on both legs. Zainab's breath caught in her throat. "I can walk," he said softly. "I always could." The world tilted. Her heart began to pound violently, each beat echoing in her ears. "You said," her voice broke. "All this time, I was pretending," he confessed. "I hid who I am because I wanted to be loved for who I am inside, not for what I have." Zainab rose to her feet, her body trembling. So the hunger, the sickness, the humiliation. Her voice rose with each word. "Was that pretending too?" "No," Kwesi said quickly, pain flashing across his face. "That was real. Every bit of it." Then why, she demanded, tears spilling freely now. "Why let me suffer? Why let them laugh at you, at us?" Kwesi's shoulders sagged. "Because I left a life of wealth behind," he said. "My family is one of the richest in the country. I was born into comfort, into power, but none of it taught me how to love. Everyone wanted something from me. I didn't know if anyone could ever choose me without seeing my money first." Zainab shook her head, disbelief crashing through her like a storm. "So you decided to test me?" "No," he said fiercely. "I never wanted to test you. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to start over. I wanted to find someone who would see me when I had nothing." Her chest tightened painfully. "And you couldn't trust me with the truth." Kwesi stepped toward her, then stopped himself. "I was afraid that once you knew, everything would change." "Everything has changed." she whispered. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold her world together. Images flooded her mind, the nights she went to bed hungry. The women's laughter on the road, her parents' cruelty. The way she swallowed her pain to protect his heart. And all along he could have stopped it. "You watched me suffer," she said quietly. "You watched them mock me and you said nothing." Kwesi's voice broke. "I watched you stand stronger than anyone I have ever known, and every day it tore me apart." She faced him again, her eyes blazing. "Then why didn't you end it? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because the longer I waited," he said, "the harder it became. And then I fell in love with you." The words landed softly, painfully. "I didn't want to be loved because I was rich," he continued. "I wanted to be loved because I was me." Zainab laughed bitterly through her tears. "And what about me?" she asked. "Was I allowed to choose who you really were?" Silence filled the hut, thick and suffocating. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can trust you." Kwesi nodded slowly as though he had been expecting those words. "I understand," he said. "I will not force you. I will wait, however long it takes." Zainab stepped past him, her movements stiff. "I need time," she said. "Time to think. Time to breathe." He did not follow her. He did not reach out. He watched as she lay down on the mat, turning her back to him, her shoulders trembling silently. That night, neither of them slept. Zainab's mind raced, torn between love and betrayal. Everything she had believed in felt fragile, now cracked by the truth. She loved him, she knew that. But love built on silence felt dangerous, uncertain. Kwesi sat on the stool until dawn, his heart heavy with regret. He had gained the one thing he feared losing most, only to realize that honesty might cost him everything. As the first light crept into the hut, Zainab rose quietly. She gathered her wrapper around her shoulders and stepped outside without a word. Kwesi watched her go, knowing that whatever came next would define not only their future but the meaning of everything they had endured together. The days after Kwesi's confession unfolded in a silence heavier than any hunger they had known. Zainab moved through the compound like a guest in her own life, present, polite, distant. She cooked, cleaned, and fetched water, but she avoided Kwesi's eyes. When their paths crossed, there was no anger in her face, only a guarded calm that hurt him more than shouting ever could. Kwesi did not follow her. He did not ask questions or demand forgiveness. He carried his stick again, though he no longer needed it, using it as a reminder of the man he had pretended to be and the choices he had made. He slept outside most nights, giving her space, waiting in the quiet the way he had waited for years for understanding, for acceptance, for grace. Zainab needed that space. The truth had cracked open her memories, forcing her to see them through a different lens. The nights she went to bed hungry. The humiliation on the road. The way she had lied to protect him. All of it was real. All of it had happened. And now she had to decide whether the man she loved was also the man who had taken her choice away. She walked long distances alone, letting the sun and dust steady her thoughts. She spoke to no one about what she was carrying. Not the village women who watched her curiously. Not her family whose cruelty had lost its power over her. This decision was hers alone. One evening, as the sky softened into twilight, Zainab found Kwesi sitting beneath the tree at the edge of the compound. His notebook closed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She stood for a moment, gathering her breath. "Kwesi," she said. He looked up immediately, hope and restraint colliding in his eyes. "I'm listening." She sat opposite him, the distance between them deliberate. "I've been thinking," she began. "About everything." He nodded, saying nothing. "I understand why you did what you did," she continued slowly. "I understand fear. I understand wanting to be chosen for who you are." His chest tightened, but understanding doesn't erase what happened," she said. "I lost my voice in your silence. I paid a price I never agreed to pay. Kwesi bowed his head. I know. Zainab held his gaze. I love you. That hasn't changed. But I cannot pretend this didn't hurt. I wouldn't ask you to, he said quietly. She exhaled. I'm willing to forgive you, she said, and the word landed with weight. But forgiveness is not going back to who I was. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean letting you decide everything again. Kwesi's eyes filled with tears he did not wipe away. Tell me what you need. I need truth, she said firmly. Always, even when it's uncomfortable. And I need respect not as your wife, not as someone you protected with silence, but as a person who deserves to choose. He nodded. You have it. They sat there as the light faded, the air cooling around them. The path forward was not smooth, but it was visible now. The next test came sooner than Zainab expected. One afternoon, familiar voices rose at the edge of the compound. Her family approached not with insults this time, but with careful smiles and cautious steps. Word had traveled quickly. Whispers of Kwesi's wealth had reached the village like wildfire. Mama Efia spoke first, her tone soft with practiced regret. Zainab, my daughter, we heard you are doing well. Zainab stood tall, her expression unreadable. I am? Baba Kweku cleared his throat. We were wrong, he said. The words sounded foreign in his mouth. We judged too quickly. Adwoa and Sika stood behind them, eyes lowered, shame flickering across their faces. We are sorry, one of them murmured. We didn't know. Zainab listened without interruption. She felt no surge of triumph, no bitterness, only clarity. When they finished, she spoke calmly. I forgive you, she said. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. Her mother's smile faltered. What do you mean, I mean? Zainab replied, you don't get to return to my life as if nothing happened. You don't get to benefit from what you once despised. Kwesi stepped forward, then standing beside her, not in front, not behind. Zainab and I have built our life together, he said evenly. We don't owe anyone proof of our worth. Mama Efia's eyes darted between them. We are family, she insisted. Zainab met her gaze. Family does not sell their children. Family does not throw water on a man begging for medicine. Silence fell. Baba Kweku bowed his head. We understand, he said quietly. We only want you to be happy. Zainab nodded. I am. They left without argument, the weight of their past finally resting where it belonged. In the weeks that followed, Zainab and Kwesi rebuilt not their house, not their farm, but the rules of their life together. Decisions were shared. Words were spoken plainly. When fear crept in, it was named and faced, not hidden behind silence. Zainab found her voice in small ways. She spoke at the market without lowering her eyes. She walked the main paths again. When whispers followed, she let them pass. They no longer defined her. Kwesi in turn learned to unlearn. He stopped trying to shield her from the world with secrecy. He listened. He apologized when he faltered. He learned that love was not proven by endurance alone, but by honesty. One evening, as they sat together watching the sky darken, Zainab rested her head against his shoulder. We're not who we used to be, she said softly. No, he agreed. We're better. She smiled faintly. We're real. The village continued to talk. Some envied them, some doubted. But the noise no longer reached the center of their lives. Zainab had made her choice not to return to the past, not to erase the pain, but to move forward with her eyes open and her voice intact. And Kwesi, standing beside her, knew that whatever came next would be built not on silence, but on truth. The move away from the village did not happen in a single day. It unfolded slowly, carefully, like a wound being dressed one layer at a time. Kwesi did not announce anything. He did not gather elders or make speeches. He simply told Zainab the truth he had avoided for so long, that there was land beyond the hills. A place far enough from old eyes and old judgments where they could begin again without shadows leaning over their shoulders. Zainab listened without interruption. She asked questions, she weighed each answer. When she finally nodded, it was not with excitement but with certainty. They left quietly. The house Kwesi brought her to did not feel like a palace at first. It felt unreal. Wide windows, solid walls, floors that did not creak with every step. Zainab walked through the rooms, slowly touching surfaces as if they might disappear. She had lived her whole life measuring space by what she was allowed to occupy. Here there were no limits. "This is our home," Kwesi said softly. Zainab turned to him. "Our home," she repeated, tasting the words. The first nights were the hardest. Zainab woke often disoriented by silence that carried no whispers, no laughter meant to wound. She expected fear to follow her into this new place. It didn't. What followed instead was grief for the girl she had been, for the life she had survived. Kwesi did not rush her healing. He watched, he listened, he learned when to speak and when to wait. Slowly joy returned, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Zainab planted flowers along the walkway. She learned the rhythm of the house, the way light moved across the rooms. For the first time, she owned more than survival. They talked about the future at night, sitting side by side, their hands intertwined. Children, travel, the ocean Zainab had never seen. Dreams were no longer dangerous things whispered into the dark. They were plans. Then the past arrived at their door. Kwesi was away one morning meeting with suppliers when a car pulled into the compound. Zainab watched from the garden, unease tightening in her chest. A tall man stepped out, his posture confident, his smile sharp. Kojo. Kwesi had mentioned him only once, his older brother. The one who had always wanted more attention, more control, more of what was not his. Zainab, Kojo said smoothly as he approached. "You're even more beautiful than I was told." She straightened. "You should leave." He laughed softly, straight to the point. "I like that. I am my husband's wife," she said firmly. Kojo's smile did not falter. "That's exactly why I'm here." Her heart began to race. "Say what you came to say." Kojo stepped closer, his eyes dark with something she recognized immediately, envy disguised as admiration. "You married the wrong brother," he said. "It should have been me." Zainab felt anger rise, clear and sharp. "That will never be true. I can give you more than he ever could." Kojo continued, ignoring her words. Power, security, a life without limits. Zainab shook her head. "I already have that, and it wasn't bought." Kojo's expression hardened. "You think loyalty will protect you? Kwesi has always been weak, even when we were young." Zainab took a step back, her voice steady. "Leave my home." Kojo's eyes flashed. "You'll regret this." He turned and walked away without another word, the threat hanging heavy in the air. When Kwesi returned, Zainab told him everything. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening. "He hasn't changed," he said finally. "He's always believed he deserves what others build." Zainab reached for his hand. "He won't have it." Kwesi pulled her close. "I won't let him near you again." The days that followed were tense but quiet. No more visits, no more messages. Kojo disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving behind only a reminder that envy often wears familiar faces. Then life answered with gentleness. Zainab realized she was pregnant on a morning filled with light. The news landed softly, almost shyly, as if afraid to ask for permission. When she told Kwesi, his reaction surprised her. He did not shout or laugh. He sank to his knees, overcome. "Our child," he whispered. "Our child." Pregnancy was not easy. There were days of sickness, nights of fear, moments when old memories tried to return. But Zainab was not alone anymore. She spoke when she was afraid. Kwesi listened. They faced each challenge together without silence, without lies. When the baby came a healthy boy with strong lungs and curious eyes, the house filled with a sound Zainab had never known before. Peace. She held her son against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Kwesi stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes full. "This is the life we built," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, with truth. News traveled as it always did. The village spoke again, this time with wonder instead of scorn. Zainab's family heard too. They did not come. They did not ask. Zainab did not feel the need to call them back. She had learned that forgiveness did not require proximity. Years later, Zainab sometimes thought of the girl who had walked barefoot behind a man the village mocked. She remembered the hunger, the shame, the silence. She smiled. That girl had survived, so this woman could choose. Zainab stood on the veranda one evening watching her son play while Kwesi joined her, slipping his arm around her waist. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold. "We didn't just escape," she said quietly. "We transformed." Kwesi nodded. Together. And in that shared certainty and a life rebuilt not on wealth alone but on dignity, truth, and choice, they found the ending they had earned.